more in detail and also share with other people. I am very happy to see many of our friends from Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, a lot of friends from Chile and from Mexico. I think, as you all know, we at Hadassah International and Hadassah Medical Organization, we have been trying to do anything we can to share knowledge, know-how, and by doing this to see if we can help in any way with this knowledge to solve and provide some solutions. And I think this is, I am very happy after so many sessions we have done since the beginning of COVID-19. I'm very happy to be introducing this session with Professor Dana Wolf, because really this is much more than sharing know-how. I think this is sharing a tool that can be very essential for the work that all of you are doing in your countries, and I hope that that will really help. This meeting is also a result of conversations and meetings that we had before, in which the issue of pooling as a technique, as presented by Professor Rothstein and myself in some introductory sessions, really came as something that could be helpful, particularly in countries in Latin America where we, countries and communities and organizations, they don't have so many resources, and pooling financial resources. And pooling can be a great solution also to organize tests in a way that is cost efficient and still provides some of the answers that we need to tackle this issue. Professor Dana Wolf is the head of the Clinical Virology Unit, specialist in internal medicine, specialist in infectious diseases at the Department of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases at the Hadassah Medical Organization. We are very, very honored and happy to have you here with us. She will be presenting some general things about COVID and about the work that she's done, and particularly about the pooling technique. That's something that everybody's thirsty to learn. So it's kind of like a learning experience for everybody. And then, you know, we will have time for some of the questions that some of you have sent, and you are invited to put your questions on the chat. If we have some time at the end, we might open the mic for questions, but please keep your mics closed so that we can hear firsthand from Professor Dana Wolf. As I said at the beginning, we really appreciate that there are representatives from the government of Chile attending this session. We think that this is a great partnership between Hadassah, the Israeli emissaries, in particular in Chile with the Israeli ambassador, and in the case of Chile, now also with the government. And I think that it's, and the Jewish community, of course, the Jewish organizations, in a way that, you know, we can help the entire society by doing these things together. Professor Dana Wolf, please.
Okay, hello everybody, and really thank you for the generous introduction, and it's my honor to be with you here today. And maybe I can share my screen, just go very quickly, give you some introduction before we get to the pooling and your potential questions, and let me see if I can share my screen here. I guess this will be my screen here to share. No, yes. Can you see?
You're here.
Here,
yes.
You see the presentation?
Yes. Yes, yes.
Oh, no, that's actually the last one. Let me see, just a minute. We need the first one here. Okay, so can you see my presentation right now?
Yes.
Good. So the title will be, well, basically I wanted to tell you very briefly how at Hadassah we rose to the challenge of COVID-19 in the clinical virology lab in terms of logistics, quality assurance, and development plans. Okay, here you can see, well, maybe I'll just, by introduction, I will tell you that just prior to the emergence of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2, the clinical virology lab had been a mid-sized virology lab serving both hospitalized and outpatients, combining, I'm not sure what is your background, so if feel free to stop me or to ask questions if you have any regarding the terms I mentioned. But we were combining serological assays, antibody measurement with culture, with viral cultures, and gradually expanding number of molecular virology assays, quantitative real-time PCR for diverse viruses affecting pregnant women, newborns, transplant patients, intensive care patients, and basically a wide range of patients. And we were steadily growing in our activity over time, combining robots and multiplex PCR assays. And this is where this pandemic basically emerged. And here you can see the pandemic transmission pattern in Israel. What you can really see is the accelerated transmission that in Israel was obvious by mid to late March as a result of travel-associated importations, mainly from the US, as we know now, large holiday gatherings, Purim especially, and introduction into the densely populated ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem, which actually made Jerusalem one of the epicenters of the pandemic transmission in Israel and required accelerated testing and mitigation strategies. So our mission or urgent aim when the second half of March, when everything was so accelerated, was to establish a high throughput SARS-CoV testing blueprint that would be reliable, efficient, and accessible. I guess it's your mission now as well. Or in more simple terms, increase our testing capacity dramatically and immediately without losing control. And here you can see the source of our samples, where they came from. So they came from outpatients, what we call Magen David Adom. It's like from the community patients, symptomatic patients mainly, followed by hospitalized patients with COVID-19, and then screened healthcare personnel and screened nursing homes, personnel and patients, and essential industries, etc. So maybe I should very briefly go over the diagnostic workflow of SARS-CoV-2. And I guess it's familiar to most of you, but it starts from obtaining nasopharyngeal swab sample in viral transfer medium, right? And then the sample arrives to the lab. We moving to sample receipt, viral inactivation. I'll come back to this point later. So we need to inactivate the virus by lysis buffer when we get the sample in viral transfer medium. And then RNA extraction, RT-PCR, reverse transcription, real-time PCR, and finally interpretation and a report of the results. Now this workflow is pretty familiar to viral diagnostic laboratories, but there were some unique or specific challenges here. One of them is a safety issue that is probably familiar to you, requiring biosafety level 2+ facility with stringent PPE, as you can see here. This turned to be quite a substantial bottleneck in terms of process streamline, a diagnostic process streamline, especially when you get many samples in one day, thousands of samples in one day. So we actually found a way to partially address or overcome this bottleneck by validating a procedure of direct sampling of patients at the point of care in lysis buffer. So obviating the need to work in a BSL-2+ facility for many of the samples. So this partially overcame this problem. But the second unique issue was the need during a pandemic for high throughput, short turnaround time, requiring multiple automated liquid handler with quite rapid exhaustions. It was global and national exhaustion of kits, reagents, and equipment. And this was very special also in Israel because we were dependent on centrally imported reagents. I mean, the Ministry of Health centrally imported the reagents. So it was a continuous struggle. But eventually here you can see our daily distribution of tests and overall testing as in quantitative terms here. So you can see how we upscaled our activity from 500 per day, samples per day, and then 1,500 samples per day, and then 2,500 samples per day. And we are now able to do smoothly, comfortably, almost 4,000 samples per day in our laboratory if we need. But right now, the epidemic declines in Israel, so we don't need this enlarged and expanded capacity anymore. So overall, by now we have performed more than 70,000 PCR tests in Jerusalem, mainly from the Jerusalem area and beyond, with around 6.3% of our samples turning out to be positive. So, of course, this rapid, multifaceted reorganization required really a lot of, I would say, reorganization in many facets of Hadassah. So starting from lab personnel, which we had to substantially expand to work 24-hour shifts. And then we had to dramatically increase our lab space. We had to deal with dynamic procurement issues all the time. And of course, the IT established a dynamic custom laboratory information management system. It was an integral part of all our activity. And we also gathered an important sub-management team, but I thought I will not tell you in too much detail about it. But the one thing I also wanted to mention in terms of this reorganization was that we actually combined forces. We were lucky to combine forces between and to form quite a unique and productive partnership between Hadassah Hospital, Hadassah Medical Center, the Clinical Virology Lab, and the Hebrew University Faculty of Medicine, which is, in our case, it's adjacent to our laboratory. It was very much supported by Hadassah Director General and the Dean of the faculty. And we could really translate it into expanded facilities and a very coordinated operation by lab technicians, volunteering researchers, both young and seniors and students, working side by side together. And the reason, one of the major advantages, the way that we managed to do it, is that all procedures and workflow were combined, were performed under the full responsibility of our certified laboratory, which we didn't have to get special licensure for the university. They operated under our umbrella, so enabling immediate move into the production phase. Now, beyond this upscaling of manpower and space, we also translated this partnership into development and implementation of new methodologies to improve testing efficiency and throughput and overcome supply chain blocks that you may experience in your countries right now. And this brings me to the pooling. All of this was an introduction to the pooling strategy that we have developed. So what we have developed in order to streamline our process was a pooling of samples at the early lysate stage prior to RNA extraction to significantly increase our throughput. So we assessed several pooling strategies. One of them is called matrix pooling. One of them is called Dorfman pooling. We had mathematics students working with us, so we kind of assessed several strategies. But the one that we eventually chose was it's called Dorfman pooling. It's 8 lysate pooling. So we pull 8 samples into one in the lysate stage before the RNA extraction. And we apply it for the screening of asymptomatic population, in which the rate of infection or the prevalence of positive results is expected to be very low, generally below 1%. So this keeps this procedure efficient, because if you pull samples when your rate of infection is really high, then you will have to repeat many of the samples, right? So we pulled, and the reason we chose 8 sample pooling, because it was because of practical considerations, is a robotic setup. Okay, so actually, if you wish, I can, at the end of this call, I can send you a small short movie which actually demonstrates. We have like student actors that demonstrates the procedure hands-on. So if you want to really watch how we actually do it, I think
that would be very useful.
More than anything that I can talk about. So we translated. So of course we couldn't do it just before without an extensive validation. So what we validated using many pooled samples was that a pooling of 8 lysates retain the clinical sensitivity even in the case of low positive samples. So this is what we now routinely employ for our screening strategy. Let's say screening of nursing home personnel, screening of hospital personnel, screening of schools when the rate is predicted to be really low. Once the rate of the positive samples increase, pooling will not be efficient. What happens is if you have a negative pool, then all the 8 combined samples are considered negative, right? And if you have a positive pool, then you have to go back to your 8 samples and to run them again. So, and sometimes you'll find 1 sample positive, sometimes 2 of them are positive in your pool. But this turned to be really efficient. So if you kind of translate it in numerical terms, for example, if you want to test a municipality of, let's say, 120,000 people, I was actually asked about it by people in Berkeley, right? So if you want to test the whole municipality, divided by 8, you can do it in a few days. So it's very efficient. We're very happy, and it has turned to be very useful and I think the paper is already online, so you can really, the paper by Ronnie Ben-Ami, Maya Antonio, Tam Breyer, so you can just read through it and look at the details. So pooling was one example of an approach that we developed. I will give you a second example, which is not final yet, but it's in final development stages. So what we have, another approach that we have taken is to develop RNA purification with homemade reagents, homemade bits that again obviate the need to rely on sometimes missing, lacking RNA extraction kits. So RNA extraction kits turned to be a real bottleneck during the pandemic, during the accelerated phase of the pandemic transmission. So we developed this, an alternative of RNA extraction that is rapid, fully automated, and very cheap, is less than $1 per sample, RNA purification, using a solid phase beads. And we have tested the method on hundreds of clinical samples, comparing it with approved RNA extraction kits. It's very promising, and it's in its final stages of development right now. And there is a lot of interest in expanding the use of this system. And then I think by this I can stop my presentation. This is my young management sub-team that I gathered. We had a logistic manager and lab 2 young laboratory managers and validation implementation manager and manager of QA. We did it really. When you expand your volume of testing so dramatically, you are going to have some pitfalls. Not all robots will work. You may have contamination of your PCR, so you really need close monitoring of the system. And we had also an industrial engineer working with us to streamline and to make all the reorganization more efficient.
Thank you, Dana. Professor Wolf, we will, I will now relay some of the questions that were asked that were written in Spanish, and for the sake of moving this a bit quicker, I will just refer to some of the questions, and then we will open to some more questions from anybody who is here. So I think that we can stop the sharing here, unless, do you need this?
No.
Okay, so great. So now we are here back. So I think there was one question, and I think that is a very, very critical question for the 4 countries that are in this meet representing this meeting, which is if this kind of pooling requires any special regulatory authorization. How was the experience in Israel? I know in every country might be different, but what's your experience with that?
Actually, that's a very good question. Once we show a very careful validation of the pooling, it has been approved by the Ministry of Health. I mean, we could, that's a good question. You know, also I should say that the approach, the regulatory approach during a pandemic is different from the regulatory approaches in regular times. It's a good question. I mean, nobody really had time to regulate things, but we regulated this approach, and we validated extensively with ongoing validation of the clinical sensitivity. I can tell you that I had some discussions with people in the US, and they are considering adopting this pooling approach as well. They're assessing. Not currently. Several labs from the US assess 5 sample pooling.
Instead of 8, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, there are several variations because the FDA may approve 5 sample pooling rather than 8.
Because of FDA regulation more than for any other reasons.
Yes.
I recommend, if there is anybody who wants to, let's focus. There are other questions that are not related directly to the pooling technique, but in order to cover properly this, if there are people who want to ask questions about the pooling, si hay gente que quiere preguntar sobre el pooling, pueden conectar el micrófono y hacer la pregunta ahora. You can ask this directly in Spanish if you want, and I will translate to English. Así que puedo traducir directamente en inglés si lo quieren preguntar en español. Pero si alguien tiene una pregunta específica sobre el tema del pooling, que es la técnica que proponemos, pueden hacer ahora. Jorgelina.
Bueno, voy a hablar en español, me va a ser más fácil.
Sí, yo te traduzco.
Quería preguntarle qué controles de calidad recomienda en el caso de utilizar los pooling para estar seguro que a uno no disminuye la sensibilidad, y al mismo tiempo si esos poolings se pueden utilizar con métodos comerciales. Muchas gracias.
Okay, yeah, the question is basically what are the quality controls and how the quality controls take care of the sensitivity of the ¿cómo se llama? Sensibilidad, I think it's sensitivity of the test. And if you could do this, the pooling with commercial materials. And this connects also with a question that some people were asking, somebody from Chile was asking about the kind of reactives is there any specific reactives that need to be used for the pooling technique, or in general that you would recommend, which we don't know exactly what kind of reactives are available in every country. So I don't know, and I'm not a specialist to even speak about what does it mean, but I think I will combine all this in the question.
Yeah, I think this is also a very good question. I think each center which decides to use pooling has to validate its own pooling. We cannot, using your specific reagents and the specific tests, RNA extraction, RNA lysis, RNA extraction, virolysis, RNA extraction, and PCR methodology that you are using at your center. There is no one for all solution here. So the methodology that we have been using is lysis by specific reagents called Zymo reagents. It's a Zymo RNA DNA shield. And then we combine several lysed samples we use the choir symphony extraction. Again, I'm not sure if I have to go into all these details, but it's a specific extraction kit and machinery, and then a specific PCR kit, right? It's called, that amplifies a specific region in the genome. And once we change, for example, if we decided to change our PCR system, we will have to revalidate it. And the way to validate it is to perform ongoing validation is to include, let's say, a very low positive samples in your pool and see that you can detect this low positive sample in each pooling reaction that you are running.
Thank you. Leonardo Basso, ¿dónde está Leonardo? Para que quiera hacer una pregunta. A ver. Para poder hacer, no te veo ahí, Leonardo. Ahí está. Ahí está, Leonardo, por favor.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Professor, for your presentation. I'm actually an engineer from Universidad de Chile, and we've been working with people from medicine to try to push for using pooling. And Dr. Torres, who is in this talk, can better explain the validation of the system. My question is related to frequency of testing, right? Because if you're looking into asymptomatics, you may not be able to find the disease today, but perhaps you're going to find it in 3 days on or 4 days after. So do you have a protocol for going back to a population and test using pool again? Say you're testing elderly people in a house, and so you test today. Did you guys go back 10 days after or 12 days after and run tests again to be sure that there was no false positives? I mean, false negatives. Thank you.
Yeah, if you test again, it doesn't say that, let's say this specific population was negative at day X, and then you test again a week later, and then you find positive. It doesn't mean that you had a false negative before, because sometimes people are negative on day X and then positive 3, 4, 5 days later.
Yeah.
So we have done it. We have done longitudinal monitoring in hospital personnel, and sometimes everybody was, well, we didn't test everybody every week, but there were people who were negative at certain week and then a positive a week later because they were exposed. And nicely, I can tell you that nobody was actually infected during the hospital work. The ones that we identified in the hospital personnel brought it from neighborhood, from neighborhood in which Arab villages or ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in which the virus circulated.
Yeah, what we're trying to do is to calculate what is the optimal frequency of going back, even the way the virus works and the risk that somebody brings this from outside. And so yes. I guess my question was whether you had calculations about frequency or you were just going back once a week.
No, we didn't have calculations. We didn't have structured calculations about frequency. No.
Okay, just so the...
I'll be happy to learn from you, from your...
Okay, we're actually calculating those things and of course we want to make sure that we are right. So I'll share this with the rest of the people in the audience later, okay? Thank you.
Yes, there are questions here, and please you can also write in the chat that you want to ask a question, and then I can unmute the phone and mic, and I just keeping the mics off because it creates a lot of noise when somebody talks. But you can write that you want to ask a question. Pueden poner en el chat que quieren hacer una pregunta, por favor. Soledad from south of Chile is asking what are the validation protocols that are recommended for pooling? If there are any validation protocols recommended for pooling?
I don't think there are generally recommended validation protocol. You have to design your own. I can refer you to our paper in which you see how we did it. But the way we went is to pull negative samples with deliberately pull negative samples with very weak positive one, with stronger positive one, to see what you lose during the pooling, actually. We started from matrix pooling, which is, it's 5-on-5 matrix pooling, which is a safer approach in a way, but less efficient. And then we proceeded to try the Dorfman pooling in accordance with the calculations, mathematical calculations of expected efficiency of the procedure when you consider a specific prevalence of infection in your population. But I think overall we went cautiously into 8/1, and the reason we chose this 8/1 was the practicality of the robotic setup. But yes, we validated it using very weak positive samples and diluting it in these 7.5, and we calculated, we looked at the exponential curve versus the phase of the curve of quantitation of the PCR. But again, this should be done for each PCR system. You cannot rely on a specific validation to adopt it immediately in your lab. You have to validate it for your reagents, your PCR system, your frequency.
Yeah, some people are already asking about the paper, which I'm sure that we can share.
It's online.
Yes, so we will share the paper, and we will also share the video that you mentioned, yes, Professor Wolf, because I think that's something that will be very useful. Rafael Aros, is asking, what's your definition for recovering?
For?
Recovery.
Our definition for recovery, oh, that's a complicated, yes, question. Maybe I should ask you the same question. But, the standard definition is two successive negative PCR tests, right? But now this definition is being tested, is being questioned, because we have seen more than once that following two successive 24 hours interval PCR test, we sometimes get a positive test already, but and then again a negative test the day after. So I think again, two negative PCR tests are still considered the definition of recovery.
Okay, there are a few other questions that
and of course, the clinical definition. I mean, I just went into the lab definition.
Thank you. There are a few other questions that I will try to translate. They were sent in Spanish. Is there any specific part of the lab where pooling is done, or any special setting that needs to be done for the pooling?
I think the movie will demonstrate it easier than words. It's, yes, we currently do it in a specific part of the lab, in a specific robot. You don't need a lot of space for the pooling. You just need the right robot that pulls your samples.
Okay, there are some specific questions. I'm going to read them. What is the significance after COVID negativization 6? And after 15 days, it has detectable SARS-CoV virus gene E and specific markers SARS-CoV-2 gen S negative. That's very specific. Hope I...
It's very specific, and I'm not sure if I followed the question. Maybe
I will send this specific, yes. I will send some of the specific questions, and we will get the answers, because they're very, very specific. Now, there is a question about how useful would be to evaluate IgG and IgM in residents for, for old age people, for senior citizens, which is many of the people here work there in these kind of institutions.
Oh, really? Okay. And you have, so serology is now evolving, as you know, and we have also used serology and actually also developed our own serology, but right now we use the commercial test, and FDA approved commercial test. Serology is not an alternative for the diagnosis of acute current infection because antibodies can appear late after infection, a week, 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks after infection. So for retrospective epidemiological analysis, it's going to be very helpful probably. For current diagnosis, the gold standard is still the direct virological assay, real-time PCR, the RT-PCR assay. There are cases of false negative RT-PCR. We know it due to suboptimal sampling or due to viral kinetics in the respiratory airway, disappearing from the upper respiratory airways. So in these cases of false negative PCR, serology may be helpful. And my experience is more with IgG test rather than IgM test, which we don't use currently. There is some debate regarding the IgA testing, which IgA probably appears earlier than the IgG, but in a smaller percentage of patients. So I see right now, IgG is better established than IgM and IgA. But this field is really evolving, and I will be more than happy to hear the experience of people here at participating in this conference.
Yeah. So first of all, anybody is welcome to share your experiences. Before that, I have one question that I think will also open this part of the conversation, more like sharing experiences and having you, Professor Wolf, as an expert. I think it's a very unique opportunity for everybody here, with many other experts from each one of the countries.
Yeah, I would like to hear your opinions too.
So I think I will frame this question in a way that opens for you the answer, and then others can share the experience, which is basically, if you look at the situation in South America, and the World Health Organization, and all the international media and the eyes are now put into South America as the main focus of growth of the infection, and it's and even though most of the countries have taken, I don't think we have anybody from Brazil, which wouldn't be an example of how this was contained. But Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, in different ways, have been relatively successful in containing the infection, but still we see the numbers, of patients being increasing every day in the last few days. I'm talking very general. There are specific situations. I think that, from your perspective as somebody who, suddenly, as you show in that graphic in the second slide, from your regular activities, suddenly having to change everything to contain this in terms of, mapping what's happening through reinventing the way you do testing. What would be your recommendation? How you would approach something like this in countries that the population is very big, and you have to sometimes very short time now to suddenly change everything, and these countries are not Israel with some kind of like, I wouldn't say unlimited resources, but proportionally, with the per capita GDP per capita in Israel, that the resources are the financial resources and the ability to produce material resources, it's much higher than the ability that the governments and institutions have in South America. I know this is like very challenging to think in a minute, and I'm not saying that this is the end of the conversation. I hope this is, just the beginning of this conversation, having your expertise in a way, thinking with everybody here. What would be your first instinctive reaction to this? What would you recommend in terms of the approach?
I think, as you mentioned, as you very nicely mentioned, the setup is very different from country to country, from continent to continent. The availability of reagents, of robots, speaking with my colleagues in the US and Europe, we faced common shortage of reagents, but each country had a different situation, each country had different accessibility to reagents. But, well, if I can give a general advice, as much as you can release yourself from dependency on kits, on the commercial kits, and you can produce locally reagents, it could be better. Try to match up robots or systems with the reagents of the systems. We, for example, we had acquired a very nice robot, but then found out after a week that we don't have reagents for this specific robot. It was Roche. So if you can look for reagents that are less, that are more accessible, that are more available to you, this would be my best advice. So look for reagents that there is less competition over them in other continents right now. And then, you know, you have to gather your own, I would say, sub-management team. You have to have a logistic manager. You have to have someone to coordinate all the system, all the reorganizations in your team, and really be very meticulous about quality control and validation. Be ready, be prepared to validate new procedures, but you have to have someone to really lead this validation. I don't know, I would like to hear from people too, how you do it. There is no one way, I'm sure.
So you can now, those who want to make a comment or ask a question, you can unmute your phone, and then, you know, directly talk. If anybody wants to do that. Marcelo Rohr, you did, yes, Marcelo Rohr from Buenos Aires.
Hi, thank you, Professor Dana Wolf.
Hi.
I'm from Buenos Aires. I'm general manager at Hirsch Center. I'm thinking all of my day. I'm thinking about this stuff, and I want to ask a question. We have heard about isolation, population isolation. We heard about protective personal stuff. We heard about testing. We heard about symptomatic testing and asymptomatic testing. What do you think is the strongest way to do it? Because in our countries, there's not a lot of money to massive tests. So we are very interested in pooling tests because we are trying to follow. I work in a nursing home and rehabilitation center, and we are following the asymptomatic people, asymptomatic personnel. If you have to think about the weight of these things, what do you think about personal protective elements, isolation, symptomatic testing, or asymptomatic testing? What do you think about all of this?
Well, depending on your rate of infection, I think asymptomatic individuals are the ones who spread, especially in nursing homes. They're the ones who basically spread. There is a long phase. It's a long incubation period. There is a long phase of asymptomatic secretion or excretion of this virus. And I think this screening of asymptomatic individuals and then isolation in accordance, or maybe cohorting, whatever I think it's going to be necessary. And this is where the setting where pooling is going to be really important in my experience. So we have recently, now infection is really waning in Israel, but there are several clusters, and the clusters are where they are in nursing homes. And there are starting to be, I hope not really starting, but right now we have some clusters in schools that return to activity. And we are now actively pursuing this screening in nursing homes, screening of personnel, screening of the elderly people in nursing homes, and screening of teachers in school, and we're doing it via pooling. And this, I think, has proven to be, and then the positive individuals are isolated or cohorted, and it proves to be really efficient, I think, right now in this waning phase.
Somebody's asking, Marcelo, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you.
Somebody's asking a question connected to this, with the experience of Israel and from your perspective of re-entering into some kind of normal life. I call it some kind because it's really some kind. It's not going back, it's going forward to the new normal. And asking about the experience with pooling done in pediatric population or school workers prior to restarting classes, as some of the countries are looking at how they will return also to a new normal or returning to school, for example. Is there anything done in that sense?
Well, I'm not aware of something really broad or systemic right now. There are some debates. Again, the schools with the positive teachers the teachers came from the neighborhoods in which the virus, usually these ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods, even recently, very recently, in which the virus is actively still circulating. But nobody really knows about the sites of active circulation right now. I mean, there are many open questions.
Yeah, I think my guess is that we are still going to be learning a lot about this for some time. It's not something that I think Professor Wolf probably will agree, and you are at the front line of this.
I'll tell you what, I don't think anybody really knows
exactly
to predict what will happen. It's a new virus. Whether it will continue low-level circulation, whether it will rise again during the autumn and winter, it's very much expected. I mean, the rest of the coronaviruses, the other human coronaviruses, are winter viruses. So we assume that this can be a winter virus as well. So who knows what will happen next autumn, next May. I think right now and I'll tell you, in our lab now, we are shifting from, I would say, 100 samples per day to 1,500 samples per day, just one day after the other. We're still, we don't know where we are standing, but we're prepared. We can expand if needed. We're now keeping our preparedness. This is the thing, keep our preparedness and really use the methodologies that we have developed to be able to mount, to upscale back if we need. It's a big question. How many personnel to keep in your lab? What's the space? What's the right space to keep? How many kits we should purchase right now? What we should be prepared for? It's a question. I don't have answers.
Now let me ask you one last question as we have to start wrapping up and summarizing. And as we don't know what will happen, nobody can predict the future, as I think nobody can really still fully understand the present of COVID. That's what the word of science, we hear from the word of science, and I hear from many people like you and others at Hadassah. It's done something like we are still learning about what this virus is and how it will evolve or not, one way or another. But I think, we don't know how long it would take. We don't know, if we're talking about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, if this is the kind of thing we have to live with. Is there any way we can see in the future some kind of test that people will be able to take at home, like they take pregnancy test, that they could take home and then know if they are positive or not before they get to the street?
I think there is a lot of interest now in saliva testing. I mean, this is probably the test that you're maybe referring to. So saliva testing, that people can, take saliva. It looks like an easy sample for a person to take at the point of care. This, again, we personally, I don't have experience with saliva testing. For some reason, people still, the gold standard is the nasopharyngeal swab. We don't get saliva samples in that, but I think a lot of interest and efforts are directed now towards quick, rapid sampling and testing of saliva. Maybe this will be the future. I mean, if there is a lot of virus in the respiratory secretions, then there must be a way to detect it really quick, like by rapid ELISA, strip, whatever, or maybe antibody treatment in your saliva, antibody detection in your saliva. I think a very important question that we haven't touched on, and maybe this will be a question before we wrap up, is the immunity against this virus. What really protects us? What is the correlate of protection? Are these antibodies? Are these T cells? How long immunity is maintained? Are we protected from this virus once we're infected? For how long? What can antibodies tell us about protection? How long they will can be detected? So I think that's a question for future studies to focus on. We are now trying to address this question.
Ricardo Barmat, last question, última pregunta. Espera, Ricardo, espera. No se escucha. Ahora.
Estamos preocupados en aquellos que tienen demora en negativizar la prueba. Algunos
We are
más allá
worried
de
about
21
those who
días.
have delayed, espera que te tradujo, si no va a ser muy largo. That have delay in showing they are negative, yes? Son negativos.
Y algunos llegan hasta los 40 días. La pregunta es...
And for some it takes like 40 days.
To become negative.
Yes.
To
So
become
the question
negative,
is...
to become PCR negative?
Yes.
Yes, I was just asked today about a person who is isolated. Actually, the head scientist of the Ministry of Health called me and asked me about his friend who is being isolated at home for 57 days because he's still positive. So it wasn't in our lab, so I asked to see the result, but there are a major issue here is that we now address is weak positive results. This RNA that remains positive wanes and appears again in the respiratory system for a long time in some individuals. What is the meaning of this RNA? I think now we gradually gain confidence to say that this low positive RNA, low amount of RNA that continues to be shed in the respiratory system is not infectious. It has been really studied in Korea. I don't know if you've heard about it, but some people who continue excreting RNA after they became negative and then positive again, they did not infect anybody around them. And also when these samples are tested in the lab for infectivity by trying to grow this virus, the virus is not grown from this sample in the majority of the cases. But what is the source of this persistent RNA? Is it like persistent RNA released from the lung, from pulmonary, from the pneumocytes, or from epithelial cells in the nose? We don't know.
Thank you so much, Professor Dana Wolf. I want to thank everybody. I want to also acknowledge and thank the presence of Emilio Santelices, as former Minister of Health of Chile and current advisor to the Minister of Health of Chile. I think we are honored to have you in this conversation. Es un honor tenerlo, ex ministro de Salud de Chile, Emilio Santelices. And I want to thank everybody for being in this conversation. We look at this as a beginning of a conversation. We are going to send everybody the paper that Professor Wolf talked about, and also the video. And there will be an open channel through the emails. You will receive an email as you all registered for the event. So we will send you this information, and you will be able also to recent questions, and we will channel all these questions to Professor Wolf, and from here we will keep the conversation on. So thank you, and we really hope that this was helpful, and thank you, Professor Wolf, for taking the time to share your experience. It's been a pleasure.